The sound of an axe striking wood echoed through the thin mountain air as Linda stood at the treeline, clutching her coat around her. 3 weeks ago, she'd been sitting on a cold bathroom floor, staring at 2 blue lines that shattered everything she thought she knew. Now, high in the Rockies, she watched a stranger with dust-streaked hands and a weather-worn face carve shape and shelter out of the wilderness itself. Each echo rolled over the hills like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Linda Carter stumbled up the narrow trail, one hand on her belly, the other gripping a worn duffel bag. Her boots slipped on the frozen ground, breath coming out in shaky clouds. The cabin ahead leaned against the wind, broken roof, cracked windows, forgotten by time. She reached the porch and dropped her bag, pulling from her pocket a small ultrasound photo now creased and damp. Her fingers trembled as she wiped away a tear, tracing the tiny blur of life she was carrying. Somewhere above, metal hit wood again, steady, sure, a stranger working through the silence. Linda looked up toward the sound, her voice barely a whisper. "Why does this place feel like it's waiting for me? What would you do if the world you built rejected you before life even began?" Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us bring you more powerful stories. Stay tuned, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Now let's begin. The wind began before midnight, low at first, like the growl of a restless sky. By the time Linda woke, snow was already pushing through the cracks in the window frame. The cabin groaned under the weight of the storm. She pulled a blanket tighter around her shoulders, her breath fogging in the cold air. A loud snap followed by a crash shook the roof. Timber splintered, sending snow and dust into the room. Linda stumbled to her feet, her heart hammering. Water dripped through a gaping hole, soaking her thin mattress. She rushed to move her bag and the small box that held the few things she still owned: the ultrasound photo, a letter from the hospital, and a necklace her mother had given her years ago. "Please, not now," she whispered, one hand on her belly as another shudder of wind rattled the walls. She gathered her things, placing them near the hearth, trying to shield them from the cold air seeping through every corner. Her fingers ached, red and raw, as she tried to brace a piece of wood over the leak. It didn't hold. The storm roared louder, and she sank to her knees, tears mixing with melting snow on the floorboards. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her unborn child. "I'll find a way. I promise." By dawn, the world outside was buried. The storm had softened, leaving a heavy silence. Smoke no longer rose from her chimney. The fire had died hours ago. She wrapped herself in her coat, trying to warm her hands near the ashes. That's when she heard it. Footsteps crunching through the snow. Slow. Steady. A man's figure appeared through the white fog. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying an axe slung over one shoulder and a wooden box in the other. His face was half hidden beneath a hood, frost clinging to his beard. He didn't speak at first, only looked up at the damaged roof, then at her. "Roof won't last another day," he said, his voice deep but calm. He set the box down, opened it, and revealed a set of worn tools, their metal dulled by years of use. Without another word, he began clearing the fallen snow from the steps. Linda hesitated. "You don't have to." He stopped her with a glance, not unkind but firm. "If it falls, you'll freeze by morning." She nodded, pulling her coat tighter. The sound of his hammer broke the quiet, echoing through the trees. He moved with precision, no wasted motion, no hesitation. Watching him work, Linda felt something she hadn't felt in months. Safety, however fragile. As the morning went on, she made tea from melted snow and dry leaves she'd stored in a tin. When she offered him a cup, he took it wordlessly, sitting on a broken chair by the door. Steam rose between them, a small warmth in the cold. "I'm Linda," she said. "Drew," he replied, not looking up. She studied him. Rough hands, cracked knuckles, eyes that carried the kind of silence born from too many years alone. He didn't ask why she was there. She didn't ask why he helped. It was enough that he did. Later, while fixing the roof beam, he mentioned it in passing, the avalanche that had taken his brother 5 years earlier. His tone was steady, but his hands paused just long enough for her to notice. "I used to climb," he said quietly. "Haven't touched a mountain since." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Grief recognized itself in others. It didn't need translation. When the repairs were done, Drew stood by the door, brushing snow from his coat. "You'll need new beams before spring," he said. "The wood here's soft. I'll bring more from my place." "You live nearby?" she asked. "Up the ridge." He adjusted his gloves, then gave a small nod, the kind that ended conversations. She watched as he disappeared back into the storm, his figure swallowed by white. The silence that followed was heavier than before, but not empty. That night, Linda sat by the small fire she'd managed to restart. Her hands still shook from exhaustion, but her heart felt strangely lighter. For the first time since she'd arrived, the wind outside didn't sound like a threat, just another part of the mountain breathing. Days passed. Each morning, Drew returned with wood and supplies. He never said much, only worked with quiet purpose. Linda found herself waiting for the sound of his boots on the path, the steady rhythm of his hammer. It gave her a sense of time again. Sometimes they spoke in fragments, about weather, repairs, how to seal the windows better. Once, she caught him glancing at her belly when she leaned down to feed the fire. His eyes softened. "You got someone coming to help you?" She shook her head. "No, just me." He didn't respond right away. Then simply, "Not anymore." It was the first kindness she'd heard in months that didn't feel forced. By late afternoon, the storm had passed completely, leaving a stillness so deep she could hear the ice cracking on distant branches. Drew finished tightening the last beam, his breath visible in the cold light. "Should hold now," he said, packing his tools away. Linda handed him a jar of honey, one of the last things she had from the city. "For helping," she said. He hesitated before taking it, as though unsure what to do with gratitude. "Keep it," he murmured. "I insist," she said softly. Their hands brushed for a brief second, a spark of human warmth in the frozen quiet. He nodded once more, turning to leave, his boots crunching over fresh snow. Linda watched him go, her heart pulling between curiosity and caution. Who was this man who built without being asked, who carried his silence like a coat he could never remove? As she closed the door and listened to the wind shift over the roof he'd repaired, she caught herself whispering a thought she didn't mean to say aloud. Maybe I wasn't meant to be alone after all. Outside, the mountain stood still, holding its breath as if it had heard her. The days that followed slipped quietly into rhythm. The wind still cut through the trees, but the cold no longer carried the same weight. Each morning, Linda woke to the sound of hammering, a familiar, steady cadence that now felt less like an intrusion and more like life returning to the mountain. Drew would arrive before sunrise, a thermos of black coffee in hand, his breath a mist in the dawn air. He'd nod a quiet greeting before setting down his tools. There were no wasted words between them, only the rhythm of work, sawdust drifting through beams of light, boots crunching on frost, the soft thud of nails finding their place in wood. Linda learned by watching him. He never lectured, never corrected harshly, just showed her how to hold a tool, how to brace her wrist, how to trust the strength in her own hands. When she drove her first nail straight, he gave a small smile, brief but genuine. "See," he said, "it's not about force. It's about patience." She laughed softly, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm still learning patience. You're doing fine." It became a routine they both depended on. While Drew repaired the beams, Linda mixed clay and straw for patching walls. When her hands blistered, he brought her an old pair of gloves. When her back ached, he carried the heavier planks himself. The silence between them grew comfortable, filled with small exchanges, glances, nods, shared meals by the fire. As spring warmed the valley, the snow thinned, revealing the dark green of pine needles and the first shoots of grass. Birds returned, and the mountain began to hum again. Together, they rebuilt the cabin until it no longer looked like a ruin but a home. Solid, balanced, breathing with them. On the day they finished the roof, Drew climbed onto the highest beam, sunlight catching the dust in his hair. Linda stood below, shading her eyes as he hammered in the final nail. When he was done, he looked down at her and smiled, a small, rare thing that seemed to lift the whole sky. "It'll hold now," he said. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He glanced out over the horizon, where the sun broke through clouds and spilled gold across the snow. "This spot catches the first light," he murmured. "You'll wake to it every morning." They stood side by side, both staring east, the wind soft around them. For a brief moment, neither felt broken. That evening, Linda made stew from dried vegetables and a small piece of meat Drew had traded for in town. They ate quietly, the fire crackling between them. Shadows flickered across the walls, no longer empty, but alive with warmth. After a while, Linda spoke. "You said you used to climb," she began. "Do you ever miss it?" He paused, spoon halfway to his mouth. The flames reflected in his eyes. "Every day," he said finally. "Caleb, my brother, he was the brave one. He planned every route, pushed every limit. I just followed." "What happened?" she asked gently. He set the spoon down. "Avalanche. It was our last climb together. I made it out. He didn't." Silence filled the room, not heavy, but respectful. Linda reached out, placing a hand near his on the table. Not touching, just close enough that he could feel her presence. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once. "I stopped climbing after that. Couldn't stand the thought of the mountain taking anything else." She studied him, the strong jaw, the tired eyes, the man who still built things even when life had taught him how easily they could break. "Maybe it's not about climbing anymore," she said softly. "Maybe it's about finding what's worth staying for." He didn't respond, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual before drifting toward the window, where the last traces of daylight faded behind the ridge. Later that night, while Drew cleaned his tools, Linda walked around the small cabin, admiring their work. The walls were patched, the roof sturdy, the air warmer. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the mantel above the fire, newly sanded, still faintly smelling of pine. From her pocket, she pulled out the ultrasound photo, the same one she'd carried since the day everything fell apart. The edges were frayed, the ink slightly smudged, but the image remained clear enough to remind her why she kept going. She hesitated, then noticed a small brass compass resting on the shelf, its glass scratched, its needle steady and true. She recognized it from the day Drew had shown her his box of old climbing gear. He'd told her it was Caleb's, that he hadn't used it since the accident. It was the one thing he'd never buried, never sold, never thrown away. Without thinking, Linda placed the ultrasound photo beside it. The two items sat together, one pointing backward, the other forward, symbols of loss and hope sharing the same small space. She stepped back and smiled faintly. When Drew turned around and saw what she'd done, he didn't speak. He just stared at the mantel for a long time, then met her eyes. Something passed between them, understanding, respect, maybe even gratitude. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "It looks right there," he said quietly. That night, as Linda lay beneath the repaired roof, she listened to the faint wind moving through the trees. For the first time since leaving the city, she didn't feel the weight of fear pressing down. Instead, she felt grounded, connected not by what she'd lost, but by what she was building. She turned toward the window. Outside, the stars shone through the clearing sky, scattered like seeds across the darkness. The sound of Drew's hammer echoed faintly from his hut up the ridge, steady, dependable, like a promise that tomorrow would come. Linda closed her eyes, her hand resting on her stomach. "We're safe," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "We're home." Summer softened the mountain. The snow that once buried the paths melted into clear streams, and the air filled with the smell of pine and warm soil. For weeks, peace seemed possible. The days followed a calm pattern, Drew repairing fences and checking the water channels while Linda tended to small garden beds she'd started near the porch. Her belly had grown, a clear curve beneath her loose dress, and Drew had quietly adjusted his work pace to ensure she never lifted anything heavy. He never said much about it, but she noticed the small things, the way he left water within her reach, how he stacked firewood close to the door so she wouldn't have to step far on cold mornings. It was care without words, the kind that felt honest. One late morning, as she swept the floor, a shadow moved across the window. The post rider from the valley approached, his figure small against the sunlight. Mail rarely came this far up the ridge. Drew was still out cutting timber, so Linda stepped outside to meet the man. He handed her a single envelope, creased and faintly smudged from travel. Her chest tightened at the handwriting. She didn't need to read the name to know it was from Adam. The postman nodded politely, already turning his horse around. Linda stood frozen on the porch, the letter heavy in her hands. She could feel the heartbeat of her past thudding against her palm. Inside, she sat at the table for a long time, staring at the envelope. Her breath came unevenly. She told herself she didn't care, that the man who left her had no place in this new world she was building. But curiosity tugged, quiet and cruel. She broke the seal. The words spilled like old echoes. "I was wrong. I've changed. We can still be a family." Each sentence pressed into her chest with the weight of things she wanted to believe but no longer trusted. He wrote about missing her laugh, about selling his apartment, about wanting to be there for their child. By the time she reached the end, her eyes blurred with tears she thought she'd already cried out months ago. She folded the letter, heart racing, and looked around the cabin as if the walls could see her guilt. The room that had always felt safe now seemed to hold its breath. On the mantel, her ultrasound photo and Drew's compass sat side by side, symbols of two paths that could never fully meet. She dropped the letter on the table and stood abruptly, wiping her face. The air felt too thick, too close. Panic fluttered in her chest. Before she could think, she lifted a loose board near the hearth, one she and Drew had repaired weeks earlier, and slid the letter underneath. The wood clicked shut above it. It was hidden, out of sight, but not gone. When Drew returned that evening, the first thing he noticed was her silence. She smiled when he entered, but it didn't reach her eyes. The light in the room felt different. "Tired?" he asked, placing his gloves on the table. "A little," she replied quickly, turning toward the stove. "The heat makes it worse." He nodded but didn't look away. Something in her voice was off. Too calm, too practiced. Over the months, he had learned to read the smallest shifts in her tone, the ones that came when she tried to carry more than she should. He didn't press her. Instead, he walked to the shelf, took a jar of honey, and placed it in front of her. "You should eat something sweet. Helps with the heat." She smiled faintly, avoiding his gaze. "You think of everything." "I try," he said, then added, almost to himself, "doesn't always help." Their words drifted into silence. The fire cracked, filling the spaces between them. Over the next few days, Linda tried to return to routine, tending the garden, helping with small repairs, but her focus faltered. She found herself distracted, replaying Adam's words in her head. The letter's weight seemed to pulse beneath the floorboards, like a heartbeat under her feet. Every time she passed that spot, her stomach tightened. Drew noticed the change. She laughed less, spoke little, and often stared toward the valley below. He didn't ask, but she caught him watching her sometimes, not with judgment, but quiet concern. One evening, they sat outside as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The air was warm and still, the sky streaked with gold. Drew had been sharpening his axe, and Linda sat nearby, humming softly to the baby. He glanced at her. "You've been far away lately." She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" He gave a small shrug. "Your eyes are somewhere else." Her throat tightened. "Just thinking." He nodded, turning back to the blade. "Thinking can be a heavy thing up here." The sentence lingered between them, gentle but pointed. She wanted to tell him about the letter, about the confusion twisting inside her, but fear held her back. She couldn't bear the look he might give her, disappointment, or worse, indifference. That night, thunder rolled across the valley. The storm rose fast, throwing flashes of light through the windows. Rain battered the roof, and the wind wailed against the shutters. Linda lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart thudding in rhythm with the thunder. She closed her eyes and drifted into uneasy sleep. In her dream, she stood between two cliffs. Below her, the valley was endless, a void of shadow and wind. On one side, Drew's voice called her name, steady and calm. On the other hand, Adam's hand reached out, offering comfort, familiarity, promises of a future that once was. The ground trembled beneath her feet. When lightning struck, she saw the faces of both men, one carved from quiet endurance, the other shining with charm that had once blinded her. The wind howled, pulling her in both directions. She tried to step forward, but her legs wouldn't move. The earth cracked beneath her. She woke with a gasp, clutching her chest. Sweat drenched her hair, her breath ragged. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she heard the steady rhythm of rain outside, the soft creak of the cabin walls, and the faint glow of the fire Drew must have tended before sleeping. Her gaze drifted to the floorboard near the hearth. Beneath it lay the letter, her secret, silent and heavy as a buried stone. Linda pressed a hand to her stomach, whispering, "I'll do what's right. I promise." But the storm outside did not answer, only the hollow echo of thunder fading into the dark. The days grew longer, but peace no longer followed. The summer light stretched across the valley, too bright, too quiet, like the calm before something neither of them could name. Linda's energy began to fade. She tired faster than before, her skin pale, her steps slower. Drew noticed it first, the way she pressed her hand to her back when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she winced when bending to pick up kindling. He didn't say anything at first, only adjusted his pace to match hers, took over the heavier work, and made sure the fire burned warmer at night. But as the days passed, her weariness deepened. She began losing sleep, haunted by thoughts she couldn't silence. The letter hidden beneath the floorboard weighed on her every time she crossed the room. Adam's words echoed like a ghost. "We can still be a family." One afternoon, Drew found her outside, sitting on the steps, her hands trembling as she tried to shell dried peas. The bowl beside her was half empty. "You should rest," he said from behind her. "I'm fine," she replied too quickly. He moved closer, crouching beside her. "You're not." The firmness in his tone caught her off guard. She looked at him, the sun outlining the edges of his worn face, the streaks of sawdust on his clothes, and realized he wasn't angry, just worried. She sighed, setting the bowl aside. "I can't rest. The moment I stop, my mind runs wild." He sat next to her, elbows on his knees. "Sometimes rest isn't weakness. It's what keeps you standing." For a long while, they sat in silence, listening to the distant rumble of thunder across the valley. It was still far off, but the sound carried a promise: another storm on the way. That evening, while Linda lay on her bed, Drew stayed up repairing something by the fire. The steady rhythm of his tools filled the cabin, soft and deliberate. She turned her head toward the sound and saw him sanding a small wooden frame, curved, delicate, familiar. "What's that?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, running his hand over the smooth edge before answering. "A cradle. I built one like it for my niece before." His voice trailed off. He didn't need to finish. She already knew the rest: the avalanche, the loss, the silence that followed. Her eyes softened. "You kept it all this time?" "Broke apart years ago. Thought maybe I'd never fix it." He paused, setting down the sandpaper. "Guess I was wrong." For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the quiet rasp of his breath. Linda watched him work, his hands steady, his movements gentle, as if each stroke of his knife carried meaning. It wasn't just a piece of wood he was shaping. It was something he'd locked away in grief, finally finding its purpose again. She felt a tightness rise in her throat. "You don't have to do that for me," she whispered. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "I'm not," he said softly. "I'm doing it because it should have been done." Tears filled her eyes, unexpected and heavy. She turned away, blinking fast. "You're too kind for someone who hides so much." He smiled faintly, though his voice stayed even. "And you're stronger than you think." When he finished, he placed the small cradle near the window, where the morning light would touch it first. Linda stared at it, her heart swelling with gratitude and confusion all at once. Later that night, the storm Drew had sensed began to move closer. The wind carried a sharp chill, rattling the shutters. Linda couldn't sleep. The letter under the floorboard seemed to hum in the silence. Finally, she pushed herself up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and found Drew still awake by the fire. He glanced up when she approached. "You should be resting." "I can't," she murmured. He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that. "Sit, then." She sank into the chair across from him. The flames flickered between them, casting their faces in shifting light. "There's something I need to tell you," she said after a long pause. Drew didn't move, just waited. "The father of my child," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "He wrote to me weeks ago." He didn't speak, but his gaze sharpened. Not angry, not surprised, just focused. "He says he's changed. That he wants me back." that he wants to be part of the baby's life. She looked down at her hands. I didn't tell you because I didn't know how. I didn't even know how I felt. The silence stretched, broken only by the crack of the firewood. Drew finally spoke, his tone quiet but firm. You still care for him? She swallowed hard. I don't know. Maybe for what I thought he was. He leaned back slightly, eyes steady. Then he should climb this mountain himself. She frowned. What do you mean? He looked toward the window, where the first drops of rain began to hit the glass. If he really wants you, if his words mean anything, he'll find the strength to come here. To see the life you've built, the woman you've become. Until then, they're just words. Linda stared at him, unsure how to respond. The sentence cut straight through her fear, leaving only truth behind. You think he won't? She asked quietly. Drew's gaze met hers. I think if he truly could, he would have already. Lightning flashed outside, followed by a rumble that shook the floorboards. She flinched, but Drew didn't move. He just kept his eyes on the storm. It's coming, he said softly, almost to himself. Storms always test what's been built. Linda followed his gaze. She could feel the air shift, colder now, tense with change. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this storm wouldn't only test the cabin. It would test her heart. That night, sleep didn't come. She lay awake listening to the wind, Drew's words repeating in her mind. He should climb this mountain himself. The truth in them scared her, not because it was harsh, but because it was right. When dawn finally broke, pale and quiet, she stood at the window watching the clouds gather over the ridge. The cradle stood in the corner, its surface catching the soft light. She reached out and ran her fingers across it, her heart caught between gratitude and dread. Somewhere down in the valley, she imagined Adam holding another pen, writing another promise. But here, in this quiet place built with calloused hands and unspoken kindness, she knew the next choice she made would shape everything that came after. The wind howled across the peaks again, carrying the scent of rain and something else, the whisper of a coming test. The first snow of October came early that year, soft at first, like powdered glass scattered by the wind. But by nightfall, it turned into something far greater. The storm clawed at the mountain, bending trees and filling the air with a steady roar that swallowed every other sound. Drew was inside, sealing the windows with thick cloth, when Linda stirred from her chair near the fire. She had grown heavier with the final days of pregnancy. Each breath carried both exhaustion and expectation. The cradle Drew had built sat near the hearth, ready, its smooth edges gleaming in the firelight. I don't think this storm's stopping any time soon, Drew said, checking the latch on the door. Linda managed a weak smile. We've made it through worse. Outside, the wind screamed through the pines. The night thickened. Then, through the snow, faint at first but growing clearer, came the low rumble of an engine. Drew froze, his hand still on the latch. Who'd be mad enough to drive up here? He muttered. A pair of headlights cut through the white blur, high beams flickering like desperate eyes. The car skidded, tires fighting the slope, before stopping near the porch. The engine coughed once, twice, and died. Linda's heartbeat quickened. She knew that sound. That car. Drew! Her voice trembled. It's him. By the time the door burst open, Adam was already half covered in snow. His coat was soaked, his hair disheveled, his face flushed from the cold. Linda! He shouted, stepping inside before the wind slammed the door shut behind him. You're here, thank God! Drew moved instinctively between them, tall and solid, his expression unreadable. "Storm's too rough to travel," he said evenly. "You're lucky you made it this far." Adam's eyes darted toward him, then back to Linda. "Who is this?" "Someone who helped me survive," she answered quietly. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Adam took a step closer, his city boots leaving dark prints across the wooden floor. His voice dropped. "I've been looking for you for weeks. I got your last address from your aunt's papers." Linda's hands tightened around the edge of her shawl. "Why?" He hesitated, struggling to steady his breath. "Because I was wrong," he said finally. "I panicked. I thought I was losing everything. My job, my future, my name. I thought I wasn't ready to be a father." "You weren't," she replied, the words soft but cutting. Adam flinched. "Maybe not then. But I am now. I've changed. Linda. I sold the business, moved out of the city. I came to bring you home." The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. Drew bent to feed it another log, saying nothing. His silence carried more weight than words. Linda stared at Adam, unsure if she was seeing the same man she once loved or just the echo of him. "You came in the middle of a blizzard for this?" "I came because I had to," he said, voice breaking slightly. "Because I can't live with what I did." Drew straightened, his gaze fixed on the window. "You risked your life driving through that storm," he said calmly. "Not many would." Adam turned sharply toward him. "You think I don't know what this looks like? You think I'm here to play the hero?" Drew didn't answer. He only reached for the kettle, poured hot water into a mug, and handed it to Linda. His movements were slow, steady, a quiet contrast to Adam's frantic energy. "Drink," he said gently. Linda took the cup, her hands shaking slightly. Adam's eyes flicked between them, the care, the calm, the shared history written in every small gesture. He swallowed hard. "Is he the reason you didn't come back?" Linda looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, you are." The storm howled louder outside, pressing against the walls as if it wanted in. Adam's shoulders sagged. "I deserve that," he muttered. For a while, no one spoke. The fire burned low, the light flickering across three faces bound by a tangle of regret and survival. Finally, Drew broke the silence. "You should stay the night," he said. "Roads are closed, and there's no signal up here. You won't make it back down until morning." Adam nodded reluctantly. "Fine. I'll leave at first light." He took off his wet coat, hanging it by the door, and sat across from the fire. Linda sat on the opposite side, the flames between them like a line neither dared cross. Drew moved quietly around the room, tending to chores that didn't need doing, checking the fire, tightening the latch, stacking more wood. It was as if he couldn't sit still, afraid of the silence pressing in too close. "Doesn't it bother you?" Adam asked suddenly, his voice rough. "Living up here, cut off from everything?" Drew paused. "Some things need space to grow again. The noise down there doesn't allow it." Adam scoffed softly. "You think hiding in a cabin makes you better than the rest of us?" Drew met his gaze evenly. "No, just quieter." Linda closed her eyes, her pulse thrumming in her ears. The air inside felt as tense as the storm outside. Two men standing on opposite ends of everything she'd lived through. One built her shelter. The other broke her heart. Both had come to define her survival in different ways. "I didn't come here to fight," Adam said after a pause. "I came to fix things." Drew turned away. Some things can't be fixed, only rebuilt. The words hung there, low and steady, sinking deep. Linda rose slowly from her chair. "Enough," she said, voice strained but firm. "This isn't about blame anymore. It's about what's left." Her hand went to her stomach as another kick caught her by surprise. She gasped quietly, pressing a palm against her belly. Both men froze. "You all right?" Drew asked. She nodded weakly. "Just strong tonight." Adam moved closer instinctively, his eyes softening. "She's almost here," he said, his tone gentler now. "Our little girl." Linda's throat tightened. The words sounded right, but something in them rang hollow, too smooth, too easy. Drew's voice came low from behind her. "Storm's getting worse. We should be ready for anything." A faint rumble shook the walls as wind screamed through the valley once more. Linda turned toward the window. The world outside was completely white. 3 lives, 1 room, and a storm that refused to end. A thunderclap split the air, shaking the window panes. Linda winced and gripped the edge of the table. The storm outside had turned wild, wind howling, snow blinding, the mountain itself trembling under the force of it. Drew was adding more wood to the fire when he heard her gasp. "Linda!" She tried to answer but bent forward instead, one hand clutching her stomach. A wet sound followed, and her knees buckled. Drew lunged forward, catching her before she hit the floor. The look on her face told him everything. "It's time," she whispered, her breath sharp and uneven. Adam sprang to his feet, his voice rising. "What's happening? Is she—" "Her water broke," Drew said quickly. "We need to move her to the bed." He guided Linda toward the corner of the room where he'd laid out blankets and supplies weeks before, always preparing, always ready. Adam followed, panic written all over him. "There's no doctor, no phone. We have to get her to a hospital." "You won't make it 10 feet outside that door," Drew cut in, steady but firm. "Roads are gone. It's us now." Linda moaned, gripping his arm. "Drew!" "I'm here," he said softly. "You're safe." Another contraction hit. She cried out, pressing her forehead against his chest. Drew held her steady, murmuring instructions. Calm, measured, the tone of someone who'd faced crisis before and learned to breathe through it. "Adam," he said sharply, without looking up. "Boil water. Bring every clean towel you can find. There's a tin box near the stove, bandages inside." Adam froze for a moment, disoriented, before stumbling toward the fire. His hands shook as he filled a pot with snow to melt. The kettle rattled from his clumsy movements, but he kept going, desperate to be useful. Linda's cries rose again. Sweat formed on her temples despite the cold. Drew's face stayed composed, though his jaw tightened with every sound she made. "You've done this before?" Adam asked, breathless, fumbling with towels. Drew didn't look up. "Once. My sister-in-law." "What happened?" Drew's eyes flickered, a shadow of grief passing quickly. "She didn't make it. But the baby did, for a while." Silence followed, broken only by the storm hammering against the walls. Linda cried out again, her voice raw. Drew knelt beside her, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. "You're doing good," he said gently. "Just breathe with me. In and out." She tried, gasping through the pain. "I can't. It hurts." "I know," he whispered. "But you can. You have to." Her fingers clutched his hand with surprising strength. Adam stood nearby, frozen, watching the man who had quietly taken his place hold the woman he'd once loved. Every word Drew spoke, every gesture, carried a tenderness Adam had never understood until now. Hours passed in fragments. Groans, commands, the crackle of the fire, the distant scream of wind. The walls rattled. Candles flickered low. Outside, snow piled higher than the windows. Linda's breaths came ragged and shallow. "I'm tired," she gasped. "I can't." Drew leaned close, his forehead nearly touching hers. "Yes, you can. You're stronger than this storm." She let out a cry as another wave of pain gripped her. Adam hovered helplessly, clutching a towel, his knuckles white. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice breaking. Drew didn't glance away from Linda. "Hold the lantern higher. Keep her in the light." Adam obeyed, his hand trembling. The flicker of flame caught Linda's face, pale, strained, but determined. She gritted her teeth, pushing through the pain. The hours blurred together until time itself lost meaning. Then, a sudden silence, broken only by the wind. Drew's voice came low and firm. "One more, Linda. Just one more. You can do this." She screamed, a sound that cut through the mountain's roar. The air seemed to pause, and then a new sound filled it. A cry. Sharp, clear, alive. The storm outside still raged, but inside, the world stopped moving. Drew's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the newborn, his expression softening with awe. The baby's tiny fists opened and closed, her skin flushed from the effort of living. Linda's tears came freely now, mixing relief with disbelief. "She's here." Drew smiled, his voice barely more than a whisper. "She's perfect." He wrapped the baby in a clean towel and placed her carefully into Linda's arms. She cradled the small bundle against her chest, her fingers trembling as she traced the child's face. "She's so small," she breathed. "So beautiful." Adam stood frozen, staring at the child that was half his and half the woman he once let go. His lips parted, but no words came. Drew turned away, giving them space. He poured warm water into a bowl and washed his hands, the tension finally draining from his shoulders. Adam moved closer to the bed, his voice barely audible. "Can I?" Linda looked up. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she nodded. He knelt beside her, reaching out slowly. The baby's small hand brushed his finger, light as a whisper, warm as forgiveness he didn't deserve. Tears filled his eyes, but he didn't wipe them away. "She's perfect," he said, echoing Drew's words. "I don't deserve to call her mine." Linda's gaze softened. "She doesn't need you to be perfect. Just honest." He looked up at her, regret written deep into every line of his face. "I don't know if I can ever make it right." "Maybe you're not meant to," she said quietly. "Maybe just knowing what you lost is enough." Outside, the storm began to ease, its rage spent. The wind softened, the snow fell slower, and a faint light crept into the room. Drew crossed to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The first pale glow of dawn touched the mountain peaks. For a long time, he watched it in silence, listening to the small, fragile cry of new life behind him. When he turned back, Linda was asleep, her daughter nestled safely in her arms. Adam sat beside the bed, silent tears streaking his face, staring at the tiny miracle he had once tried to deny. Drew moved to the fire, adding the last log. The flames rose, golden and steady. The storm had broken, but what lingered in its place was something deeper, quiet, raw, and unspoken. A man who had lost everything found himself whole again through a child not his own. A woman who had been abandoned found the strength she never knew she had. And a father, too late, finally understood what love truly meant. As the baby's cries softened to coos, Drew whispered to the mountain beyond the window. Not a prayer, not a plea, just a promise. She's safe now. Days passed before the roads cleared. The storm had left the mountain blanketed in heavy snow, the world outside muffled and slow. Sunlight finally broke through the clouds, glinting off the frozen ridge. Smoke curled softly from the cabin's chimney, rising straight into the still air, the first sign that the mountain had begun to breathe again. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. The chaos of the night before had given way to a fragile calm. Linda lay resting in the bed near the window, her newborn daughter cradled against her chest. Drew sat nearby, mending a broken chair leg, his movements quiet and methodical. Adam stood by the door, staring at the snow beyond the porch, his coat already on, his face pale from sleepless nights. He had stayed long enough to make sure they survived. Nothing more, nothing less. Linda stirred, her voice weak but steady. You don't have to go yet. The road might still be rough. Adam turned to her, a small, tired smile on his lips. You've already gone farther without me than I ever thought you could. I think I'll manage. Drew didn't look up from his work, but his hands slowed for a moment, listening. Adam stepped closer to the bed, his eyes softening as he looked at the baby. She's beautiful, he said quietly. Looks like you. She's both of us, Linda replied. He nodded, though the words seemed to sting. Maybe in her, we did one thing right. The silence stretched. The fire popped, sending sparks into the dim air. Linda's eyes met his. Not angry, not forgiving, just honest. Where will you go? Back down the mountain, he said simply. Maybe further than that. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not running from what I've done. She looked down at her daughter, brushing a finger across her tiny forehead. Her name's Lily, she said softly. After my mother. And after the flower that blooms where you least expect it. Adam smiled faintly, his eyes wet. It suits her. He lingered a moment longer, memorizing the sight of them, mother and child in the glow of the morning fire. Then he straightened his coat, his shoulders heavier than when he'd arrived. Drew, he said quietly, glancing toward the man still working by the hearth. Thank you. For saving them. Drew lifted his gaze at last, meeting Adam's eyes. There was no pride in his expression, only quiet resolve. Take care of yourself, he said. Adam nodded once. You're a better man than I was. Drew didn't answer. He didn't need to. Adam stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. The wind caught his coat as he made his way down the trail. His footprints marked a single path through the white expanse, fading slowly with each gust of snow. He didn't look back. When the last trace of him disappeared beyond the ridge, Linda exhaled, as though releasing a weight she had carried too long. He's gone, she whispered. Drew set the mended chair aside and walked toward her. You did what you had to, he said. Her eyes filled with quiet sadness. Do you think he meant it, that he's changed? Drew hesitated. Maybe. Sometimes truth doesn't fix things. It just shows you what's broken. Linda nodded, gazing down at Lily. She deserves better than broken. She has it, he said softly. The day stretched slowly. The storm had left damage around the cabin, cracked shutters, scattered firewood, snow piled against the door. Drew spent the afternoon clearing it all, moving with calm precision. Linda watched from the window, the baby sleeping soundly against her shoulder. Each time he passed, she noticed the small details, the careful way he handled the axe, the quiet patience in his steps. There was no grand gesture, no claim, only steady, humble devotion. By evening, the cabin glowed with warmth again. The repairs were done, the fire strong. Drew set his tools aside and stood for a moment, studying the sky through the open window. The storm clouds had moved on, revealing streaks of orange and violet fading into night. Linda spoke softly from behind him. "The mountain looks different now." He turned slightly. "How's that?" "Less angry," she said with a faint smile. "Like it's finally resting." Drew nodded. Maybe it was never angry. Maybe it was just waiting for us to stop fighting it. He moved closer to the fireplace, picking up something from the mantel, his old compass. The glass was scratched, the metal worn dull, but the needle still pointed true. He turned it in his hand for a moment, then set it down beside the cradle Drew had built for Lily. The two objects sat side by side, the compass pointing north, the cradle carved smooth and strong. Past and present, loss and renewal, both resting in the same light. Linda looked at them, her eyes shining. "That compass still works." Drew gave a small smile. "Always has. Just needed to remember where it was meant to point." "Home?" she asked. "Something like that." The baby stirred, letting out a soft cry. Linda lifted her gently, rocking her back to sleep. Drew stood watching them, a calm settling over him that felt unfamiliar but welcome. Outside, the wind had died completely. The stars began to emerge one by one, clear and steady over the ridge. When Linda finally spoke again, her voice was quiet, filled with something close to peace. "You know, for a long time, I thought this place was a punishment. For my choices, for being alone. But maybe it was saving me all along." Drew looked at her, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. "The mountain doesn't punish," he said. "It tests. You just had to prove you could stay." She nodded, gazing down at Lily's sleeping face. "We're staying." Drew nodded once, firm and certain. As the firelight flickered across the cabin walls, the compass caught the glow, its needle locked north, steady as a heartbeat. Beside it, the carved cradle rocked gently with the rhythm of the sleeping child. For the first time in years, the mountain felt kind, not a place of exile, but of belonging. The storm had taken much, but it had left behind something that would last. And in the silence that followed, the faint creak of the rocking cradle became the mountain's new song. Soft, steady, alive. By the time the last snow melted, the mountain had transformed. The air smelled of wet pine and thawing earth. Tiny streams cut through the slopes, their water glinting like silver veins under the morning sun. The silence that once felt heavy was now full of sound, the soft rush of meltwater, the call of birds, the rhythm of a hammer striking wood. Linda stood just outside the cabin, her daughter nestled against her chest in a woven sling. The baby, Lily, slept peacefully, her small breaths warm against Linda's skin. Drew was a few yards away, high on a ladder, driving the final beam into place on the porch roof. Each swing of his hammer rang through the crisp air, steady, sure, alive. It was the same sound that had first carried across the valley months ago, but it meant something different now. Back then, it had been survival. Now, it was life continuing, the sound of rebuilding not just a cabin, but two people who had learned to stay. Linda smiled softly, rocking Lily as she watched him work. His hair had grown longer, sun-bleached at the edges. There was less hardness in his posture now, more ease. Every movement carried quiet confidence, a man no longer fighting ghosts, but building something he intended to keep. When he noticed her watching, he paused to rest, wiping sweat from his brow. "Roof's done," he said, his voice warm, touched with quiet pride. "Won't leak again, not even in a storm." "I believe you," she replied with a smile. He climbed down, setting the hammer aside. The two of them stood together on the porch, looking out over the valley. The snow line had retreated to the peaks, revealing the forest floor, damp, green, alive. For a long while, neither spoke. The breeze carried the scent of sap and the faint cry of an eagle circling overhead. Lily stirred in her sling, making a small, content sound before drifting back to sleep. Linda's eyes softened. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think survival meant running away from everything that hurt. Leaving the city, hiding here. I thought that was strength." Drew looked at her, waiting. She continued, her voice steady but thoughtful. "But maybe survival isn't about leaving. Maybe it's about staying long enough to build something new out of what's left." He nodded, his gaze moving from her to the half-finished railing he'd been working on. "Maybe that's the only kind of strength that lasts," he said. "Anyone can climb. Not everyone learns how to stay." Their eyes met, the kind of look that didn't need words. The mountain wind brushed past them, carrying the scent of cedar and melting snow. Drew reached out, adjusting the blanket around Lily's shoulders. "She's growing fast," he said. "She is," Linda whispered. "She smiles every time she hears you hammer." He laughed softly, surprised by the warmth of it. "Then I'd better keep building." They both turned to face the cabin, now sturdy, finished, and full of life. Its walls bore the marks of their shared work, uneven boards, knots in the wood, faint traces of paint. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Inside, the fire crackled gently. The old compass still sat on the mantel beside the carved cradle. Its needle pointed north, unmoving, steady as ever. Drew had oiled its casing a few weeks back, polishing it until the metal shone. "That compass," Linda said, glancing toward it through the open door. "It always points home, doesn't it?" Drew looked at her, a slow smile forming. "Only when you stop running from where you belong." She let the words sink in. For the first time in years, they didn't sting, they felt true. A gust swept through the clearing, fluttering the laundry line strung between two pines. Small baby clothes dancing in the breeze. Linda adjusted Lily's sling and stepped closer to Drew, her shoulder brushing his arm. They stood like that, quietly, as sunlight filtered through the trees. The valley stretched below them, green and gold, dotted with wildflowers breaking through the last of the snow. The air hummed with quiet life. Drew reached for the hammer again, his tone light. "There's still one beam left on the side window," he said. She smiled, teasing. "You said that last week." He shrugged, picking up a plank. "A builder's job is never really done." Linda chuckled softly, shifting Lily in her arms. "Then maybe that's a good thing. It means there's always something left to look forward to." He looked at her, eyes warm. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Always something left to build." As he lifted the hammer, the sound returned, steady, rhythmic, no longer the lonely echo of a man hiding from the past. It was different now, full of warmth, purpose, belonging. The kind of sound that spoke not of survival, but of home. Linda swayed gently with Lily, humming under her breath. The baby opened her eyes briefly, catching the light before closing them again, as if she too understood that the mountain no longer meant fear. In the distance, snowmelt cascaded down the rocks in thin ribbons of silver. The world was moving again. The cold months had ended, but their memory lingered, not as pain, but as proof of endurance. Drew drove one last nail into the beam and stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers. He looked at Linda and smiled. Quiet, certain, content. "You've built something strong here," she said softly. "So have you," he replied. For a moment, all was still. The cabin, the trees, the world holding its breath. Then came another strike of the hammer, strong, certain, alive, echoing through the valley like a heartbeat. It was the same sound that had begun everything, yet now it meant something entirely new. Healing, renewal, the promise of days that no longer hurt. Linda looked up at the sky, the morning light washing her face. She pressed a kiss to Lily's forehead and whispered, "We made it." The cabin glowing against the endless green, smoke curling gently upward, the faint sound of hammering carrying over the hills. Not a story of escape. A story of return. A story of what it means to stay. Would you have trusted the mountain, or the man who built your shelter? Comment where you're watching from, subscribe, and join us tomorrow for another story that proves every broken beginning can still find its home.